I'm sure you already know what a blues lick is. And you're probably also already working on making your own jazz licks. But there's also this almost magical sound that you get when you mix the two. So you're gonna get material that you can use as bluesy sounds in your jazz solos or as more sophisticated material in your blues solos. And in this video, I'm going to go over some of the different things you can do and some stuff you can easily add to your playing to mix those two sounds. My name is Jens Larsen, learn jazz, make music. So I'm going to cover some really effective ways of using phrasing and some melodic ideas that are pretty simple. You probably know them already, you just never thought about using them like this. And this can really transform your playing, really give you some new dimensions to how you improvise over a jazz standard or how you're improvising over a jazz blues. And really this is about taking some pretty basic melodies and then getting them to sound more bluesy. So for this video, I'm going to keep it pretty simple. All the examples that I'm gonna go over are using a B-flat 7 chord. So think about this kind of sound, and of course that would be this scale. And of course I'm also mixing that with a blues scale, and that would just be the basic box 1 minor pentatonic sound, like. Adding the occasional blue note, like. As I'll show you in a little bit, then this first example is in fact just made from an embellished B-flat 7 arpeggio. But I think the first thing I want to talk about is the use of grace notes, because here I'm really using grace notes to get the blues phrasing in there. Grace notes are this way of just having a note sort of leading into the main note that you want to play. So if I play that on a B-flat major triad, then that could be something like, or on a B-flat 7 arpeggio. So here I'm using slides to add the grace note. You can also use hammer-on pull-off. It really depends on what kind of grace note you want to add to it. And that's just a great way to really just draw out some notes and give them a little bit of extra flair. I think you could say that grace notes are really the way that jazz guitar players emulate bending. When the style of jazz guitar, the way that we play it now, was evolving and was developed, then I think most people actually played with amplifiers that didn't have really a lot of sustain, and they also played with fairly heavy strings, which is probably why bending is not used as much. I think that's something that's really more associated with louder amplifiers and more sustain and thinner strings. If you look at example 1, then you can actually see that most of the notes I'm playing are really just this B-flat 7 arpeggio. So really just these 5 notes where I have the root again on top. And then I'm of course sliding into some of the chord tones. So in this first one, the 3rd, and a little bit later in that bar, the 7th, and then again the 3rd, adding a little bit of chromaticism, and then ending on the root. So really sticking to the simple chord tones, keeping it really basic, but just adding a little bit of phrasing and also a little bit of chromaticism, and then you have a jazz blues lick. So here it's becoming less of an 8th note line. It really sounds a lot more like a blues phrase, but I'm just really using the grace notes a lot more as well. Again, still just sticking with the chord tones when I want to add the grace notes and sliding into them. An important part of playing the blues and really getting the sound right is also about being a little bit unclear, a little bit vague about the phrasing, but you still need to focus the camera. That's better. There are 2 things that you can take away from this example. The first thing is that you can make phrases that really mix stuff that's straight jazz with stuff that's more sort of straight rock blues. And that's what I'm doing in this example. The first part is really just an arpeggio based line. It's a D half diminished arpeggio. So on the B-flat 7, that's the arpeggio from the 3rd. And then the next part is really just B-flat minor pentatonic. The other thing you want to take away from this example is that it's using a lot of 8th note triplet rhythms. And this is also something that's really connecting to the blues, because blues is more about shuffle and triplet, and you have more of this kind of feel. So So the triplet subdivision is much more present, and you can use that in your phrasing, probably anyway want to have in your phrasing. Another example of how you can do that could sound like this. So this example is a little bit shorter, and I'm starting with sort of the minor pentatonic, the blues sound, and then I'm sort of resolving back into the chord, going back to a more jazz approach with sliding into the third and then ending on the fifth here. And I'm using a large interval, and that's also something that we can take away from the blues. That's really also a great aspect of blues phrasing that we can incorporate into our playing, and that's the next bit. As you may know, one of my biggest influences when it comes to actually just learning electric guitar, but especially learning blues, was Stevie Ray Vaughan. And I especially always like the way that he uses large intervals, something that if you check, Wes Montgomery is also really good at in his blues playing. And if you want to get started incorporating larger intervals into your lines, whether it's jazz lines or blues lines, a good place to start is to work with skipping around in the arpeggio, because in that way you're starting with a note that works with the chord, and you're also ending with a note that works with the chord really well. And that makes it a lot easier to make lines that are just gonna sound more natural. One of the defining intervals in the sound of the blues, and also in this case in the sound of the chord, is the tritone interval. So in this case, I'm using the one that's really in the chord, in the B flat 7, and that's the one between the third and the seventh. I'm playing this an octave higher, and it becomes sort of a signal sound. It's also the kind of interval that you're not going to be using really a lot in more sort of traditional jazz lines. So it is really a different kind of sound. You will hear Kenny Burrell and Wes use it in this way also really effectively. Just moving from that interval down to the fifth of the chord, turning it into a motif, and then giving it first ending, and then repeating, and then turning it into a blues line, really using minor pentatonic. I think you probably agree that this first example is maybe more typical for how the jazz guys like Burrell and Montgomery will play larger intervals in their blues phrasing, and maybe not that typical for the kind of lines that you would expect from Stevie Ray Vaughan. But you could take one of his signature phrases, which he actually kind of got from Albert King, I think, and then turn that into a jazz blues line. That would sound something like this. The important thing here is that when he's ending the phrase, it's almost like he's doing a bebop thing, because he's playing the chord tone here and then skipping down to another chord tone under it and introducing a large interval here, which is something that's very typical for bebop, even though this is really not the kind of groove or the kind of tempo that you would expect it in a bebop phrase. There are two very common but very different types of double stops that you want to incorporate into your playing if you want to check out some really solid jazz blues phrases. The first one is what I'm using here, that's a pedal point. So essentially I have a lower melody, which is really the melody that I'm playing. So just a simple scale melody, but I'm adding color to it by having this higher pedal point or drone note, and then adding a short ending to that, resolving back into the chord. And that's really what makes this line interesting. I have a simple melody, but then it's played against this pedal point. The other thing you want to notice here is that I'm also playing the same phrase twice, but I'm moving it in the bar, and in that way shifting it rhythmically, and that's also making it interesting. Another thing that is also common both in jazz and blues. The other type of double stops that I'm using in this example is really just about harmonizing a melody with an interval and then moving both intervals and having just a harmonized melody, similar to how you play a chord solo essentially. And that's also what's happening here. I start with the root without any harmony, and then I have this long chromatic line that I'm just harmonizing with the third interval, so, and really ending inside the chord, so on the fifth and the seventh, moving down, another pickup, which is just the root, and then we get this sort of pretty standard blues phrase. And then moving on down the chord. This is again just already here inside the chord, more chord notes. And then approaching the third and the seventh from below. and ending the line like that. Getting this into your playing is about just finding simple melodies that you can try to add intervals to. But another thing that you can do that also works really well, and that you can also see in this example, is that you can take the grace notes that I talked about in the beginning and then start to harmonize them. Just add chord tones around it wherever that's practical, and in that way add some double stops to your soloing. As you've probably already discovered, then the biggest study in jazz is not really about what notes to play. It is much more about how you play them and how you make melodies with them. And if you want to check out some videos where I'm talking about it, approaching it from that point of view, then check out this short playlist where I have some videos about phrasing and about using arpeggios when you're making licks, and really how you get to the point where you can make better, stronger melodies.